I want to talk about the source of intergenerational correlation in earnings and its joint work with George Gale from WashU and Mehmet Soyta from Ozegen. And there is a really large literature that is concerned with measuring the intergenerational correlation in earnings, which is an important measure of mobility. And this is not the purpose of this paper, but the purpose of this paper is kind of explore and analyze the underlying mechanisms that generate this persistence in earnings and affect intergenerational mobility. And basically, we're going to focus on parental education. So we know that parents' education is going to affect the outcomes of their kids. And it's been, the literature has focused on it before. But we want to also account for the behavior of the parents and the allocation of time and the investment of monetary resources and time. When children are young, there is a growing body of evidence that time with kids and investment in early childhood is actually important. And we're going to focus on a couple of things that have to do with the outcomes directly or the decisions of the parents. One is fertility, because if you're looking at allocating scarce resources, both money or time early on, if you have more kids, you have, time is limited. And also the number of the spacing of the kids, because we're looking at the first investment in time, especially in the first 5 years. And we need to understand how households are specialized in terms of labor supply and time with kids. And also we need to understand the role of assortative mating, because people have noted that part of the increase in inequality has to do with there are certain claims with assortative mating. More educated people are married educated people, and their kids are more likely to be educated. So we're going to look at all these factors and try to look at the mechanism that kind of generate this persistence in earnings. Here are the sources. Let me jump more quickly. What are the sources of correlation we're going to account for? One is, so people call it nature. It's not really nature, is parental education and maybe some innate skills. They are actually going to be determined endogenously in our model, but when the parents are making the investment, in the kids, they're going to already be predetermined. So we want to kind of look at the direct impact of, just transmission of education and skill directly to the kids versus the indirect income effect, which is the effect of education of skills on the decisions of investment in kids that households and parents are making when children are young. And we kind of want to disentangle and figure out what the mechanism is. So what does affect investment in our paper or in our model? Fertility, meaning the number of kids and their spacing. Markets are going to be important, and I'm going to talk about it. And we need to understand how time allocation occurs and how households are specializing in time allocation. So when I talk about markets, we're not going to have endogenous marriage market, but we're going to look at the effect of assortative mating and the formation, of the couples, as well as the labor market. So it turns out, which was kind of one of the surprising results of the paper, is that the earning structure is actually important in generating persistence in earnings across generation, and I'll be more explicit in the next slide. So here is what we're going to do. We're going to form a dynastic life cycle model. So it's going to be a model in which parents are altruistics and the utility function of the kids are in the utility function of the parents. Of course, the utility function of the children's children is in their utility function. So it's really an infinite horizon or infinite horizon model. However, so this is along the lines of the Barrow-Becker type of models in which you have endogenous fertility with these generations, and we're going to incorporate life cycle model within each generation's period, because we want to explore the decisions that households make within their life cycle of fertility, time allocation in kids, and labor supply. So that's roughly the extension. We're going to estimate the model. We're going to use 2 generations from the PSID to estimate it. And we have a paper that actually show methodologically how to estimate this type of models, which can become computationally intensive very, very quickly. And again, so in the model, you have life cycle problem for adults. Every period, they're going to choose how much to work, how much time to spend with kids. Now, because you have monetary investment, how much you work, there are trade-offs. If you work more, you have higher income, but at the same time, the cost maybe of spending time with kids is larger if you work a lot. Fertility, and then the spacing of the kids, assortative mating, and time with kids.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So the original Becker-Antonis model thought very strongly about networks that the parents provide for the children. And of course, this is something that is very hard to measure. But this is, of course, where the children are placed in certain job opportunities. Can you comment on this? I know you're not going to model this, but can you comment on this, what you think, what the magnitude of such a contribution could be to this persistence?
It's a good question. So here we're only focusing on transmission of human capital, so I cannot really comment on it. However, we are trying to extend it to have some savings and bequest, and maybe, but you cannot, quantitatively, it's kind of hard to tell. But what we do know is that human capital is a first order determinant.
Sort of social capital that really comes in there.
I agree. So we cannot separate. We're not going to be able to separate these things. However, I do think it's an important avenue, and we do have a framework that if you do have data that allows you to separate it, you would be able to actually tell. So I think for future research, this thinking about these extra issues and including all these things in one framework and let the data kind of identify, the relative importance would be actually important to understand the persistence. All right, data. So, literature. Okay, so this literature is enormous. So I'm not going to talk. I have limited time. So there is a small and growing literature that looks at the actual mechanisms that generate this mobility and persistence in earnings across generations, and where the contribution to this specific literature is that we are focusing on the investment in time in kids. We're looking at this data, the time allocation with assortative mating and endogenous fertility to really understand the formation of skill, looking at investment in young age. So this type of model has not been estimated before. And we're separating like the effects of markets from parents' skills, parents' behavior in this framework. So for the interest of time, I'll just skip it. It's almost impossible to really give a good overview for the literature. So data. Okay, so the problem is that to estimate a model like that, we're going to have a stationary equilibrium sort of that we're going to estimate. You need to be able to link parents and children. We need to observe the behavior of both the husband and the wife, or the two spouses, meaning the labor supply, some measure of time with kids, fertility, and we need to see the outcomes of the kids. And for some kids, we observe the labor market outcomes because we're interested actually in long-term outcomes. So if the investment early on affects the education of the kids will affect their skills, and it's going to also affect their lifetime earnings, but also who they're going to marry, because we're taking into account the assortative mating. So you really need to reach data in order to estimate a model of that sort. So it's not perfect. The problem is that, so in this paper, we're just focusing on married or cohabiting households, but they're fairly stable. Most of them are married, and they're only white individuals. And we're linking 2 generations. So the main issue is that we don't have a good measure of actual time spent with the kids. Now, the PSID does have some supplements, but I need the whole panel. So we're looking at years from 68 to 96. We do robustness to actually check how the measure. So we only observe home hours. So how much time you spend at home. It includes probably time. It includes time with kids, but it's not time that is actually spent with kids. So let me.
Just one minus labor supply, or is that
no.
Separate measure
separate, like it's separate measure. I'll show you time at home. So we do something that has been done in the literature. We've done a bunch of robustness tests, and in other papers that we've used, that we actually compare it to actual measures of time with kids, and our measure is consistent. So this is how we constructed it. We basically look at the home time, let's say, of people with a certain, let's say, with a certain education and gender, and look at how much time they spend on home hours before they had kids, and the gap is basically attributed to time with kids. So it's sort of a residual. There are a couple of ways to do it. Now we discretize the time with kids to have no time, medium time, and high time, because everything we're going to do is in discrete choice. And we're checking the patterns. We're comparing it both to the ATUS, the time use survey data, and also now the CDC from the PSID. And our patterns are actually comparable, definitely, of the discrete choice. The magnitudes kind of vary, but that's the best data sets right now that we have. Surprisingly, though, so it captured not just time with kids, maybe other things. However, despite the fact that it's a noisy measure with kids, I'm going to show you that even if you controlled for parents' education, parents' income, whatever you want, there is still a very large impact of this noisy measure of time, in the of parents with kids in the first 5 years, 15 years later on completed education. So we're actually, and it's large, the magnitude is large, and I'll show you that. So we are capturing something actually in this data. So just quickly, summary statistics. So it's not a representative sample. We do have a paper with single parents and the entire sample. We focus on married couple to understand the dynamics of couples and the time allocation. So a couple of things that I want to point out. This is just summary statistics. First, so these are 4 education categories: less than high school, some college, and college. This is the women, and these are the men in the sample. First, we don't see, so usually you kind of expect negative correlation between income and fertility. So in this sample, it's not really true. So college-educated people have slightly higher or the same, maybe, number of kids, but you don't see the negative correlation, and I'll comment on that, or in the sense of quantity quality. Labor income is what you would expect, like more educated women and more educated men have higher income. This is the housework. So this is our normalized measure of time with kids. And a couple of interesting things that would be important. If you look at women, college, so the time with kids, this is annual, spent with kids is higher for more educated women. For men, college-educated men spend the most time with kids, but with the exception of some college, it's still increasing, but some college is a little bit weird. And so, in principle, more educated people spend more time with kids. Another thing is the labor market hours that is going to be important.
Limor, is it for time with kids? Is that having people with any number of kids, or people with one kid, or
that's everybody?
That's so the fact that college people they probably have fewer kids as well. So
not here actually.
Oh, is that right?
But we do have in other papers. We looked at the time per child. The average. It's true. So college-educated women definitely spend more time with per child.
So can I just make? So you must be normalizing by college the number of children. How should I read one for women college?
Oh no! So this is summary. It's not completed fertility. It's not, and we have it's both generations. So for some of the kids that are younger, so we don't see their completed fertility. So it includes a lot of zeros.
So it's actually
one.
It's not
really an average. It's not that an average person with college have one kid. That's not. So this is a little. That's why I should kind of improve the way I present the number of kids. The patterns are true. Even we don't really have completed fertility in general, but this is literally like a data summary stat
of your sample of all different ages.
Yeah. So it doesn't mean it's not completed. Yeah. So you have a lot of zeros here. including with the time with the children, you have zeros. But the main point is the following. If you look at the labor market hours, college-educated women actually work less. If you look, they work less than some college women. They work less than high school women, okay? And they spend more time with kids. For men, men put less time with kids than women. College-educated males also put more time with kids, but they also work more. So we need to understand both the time allocation by type of household and in terms of the education of both spouses in order to kind of understand the investment behavior of parents in their kids. So a couple of things. First, again, we don't really see a strong patterns, which you will see in a cross-section of negative correlation, let's say, between wealth and number of children. It does not mean that that the quantity-quality trade-off forces don't work here, and let me elaborate what that means. On one hand, if kids are normal good, which we think they are, more educated people and wealthier people should have more kids. That's not what you usually see in the data. And what we will have here is that you have opportunity cost of time. If kids early on are time-intensive goods, it's more costly to more educated parents. The cost of time is higher to put time in kids. Secondly, there is demand also for quality of kids, right? You will see it in the utility functions. So there is sort of still substitution that would go on. But these two forces are going to operate together, and it's an empirical question whether you should see that number of kids, right, increasing or decreasing with wealth. So again, it's stable, fairly stable married households, and I think I said that. But what it means is that the trade-off, in order to understand the investment patterns of monetary and labor supply and time with kids, you kind of have to understand fairly complex dynamics and trade-offs within a household. All right, so dynastic model. The utility function of the kids are in the utility function of the parents. There is only transmission of human capital here in this model. In this framework, adult males and women just form a household in the first period of adulthood. Here we're going to have a unitary household, and they choose consumption every period, birth and time with kids, for the period that the female is fertile. And then children become adults. What's important here is that we're assuming that the education and skill of the kid is only determined once the parent finished, like 5-6 years after the fertile period ends, because we cannot allow interactions between decisions and outcome of kids and fertility decision and time with other kids of parents, because that kind of creates.
I should wait for you to see the whole model. But so since human capital is the only state variable at the beginning when they first match, and mating, so your assortative mating is going to be only on human capital, or are there shocks at the beginning as well? That
it's a stochastic function, so it's literally estimated from the data. Let's say a distribution function by education. So
just education.
Just education. We have done it both on 2 dimensions before. Here, it doesn't give us that much more. So we kind of simplify things here. And then children become adults, and it repeats. So let me jump to the model.
And human capital is not just education; it's more than that.
It's education. So we have 3 dimensions actually. You have education, then some skill. It's going to be some fixed effect, basically, from earnings regressions. But it's a fixed skills, and then you accumulate experience over time in the labor market. So these are the dimensions of human capital that we have here.
And when they match on that, maybe are you going to show us explicitly what they're matching on?
Yeah, but here they're just, in this framework, they match like as soon as just an education when they become adult. Okay. So we have males and females, and this is so they have a vector for type. So again, the vector XF, XM just includes the education and the labor market or productive skill. And and then you're a child for a certain number of periods, and the first 5 years are early childhood where parents make investments. Later on, kids are just costly, but there is no active investment. And so they become adult at T plus 1, and then they live for T periods. And that's the matching function. So in general, we have done it on 2 dimensions. Here, right now, it's just on education. But again, we don't really lose that much in terms of...
So they choose their education before they become adults? Or
no, there is no choice of education. So what's going to happen? And there is no divorce here, and there is no borrowing and savings. Okay. So no, there is no education. The kids do not do... The kids, before you only start making choices once your education and skill are realized. So basically, we have a stochastic, basically what we call production function of education, but the choices of the parents in the first 5 years are going to be mapped into, in probability, into your education outcome. Conditional on education outcome, you'll have another transition function that will take you to the skill.
But those probabilities, are you going to show us that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Let me get to the model. So a couple of things. Here are the choices. So it's all discrete choice here. So we have labor supplies, no work, part-time or full-time. The same thing with time with children, low, medium, high. Birth is a 0-1 choice in each period. So our state variables include each child. We keep track of when they were born, their gender, and how much investment each parent made during their life cycle. And we have to also, so we have to kind of have past time with kids choices, but also past time with time in the labor market, because experience would be productive in the labor market. So we have to keep track of all those. And of course, once you decide to have a child, there is going to be birth. It could be 50-50 boy or girl. However, given that it's sequential choice, we do have the, we do capture the fact that if you have maybe 2 boys, you're more likely to have another kid, sort of kind of an Ingris-Evans type of thing. So, all right, wages are the marginal product. So earning function is fairly standard. We're going to have age education profile interaction and returns to part-time job, full-time jobs. And then we have the experience. And we are going to have experience 4 years back, because afterwards it's kind of insignificant. And it matters whether you have full-time experience and part-time experience. So, and these returns could vary by gender. So it could be that what we do find, penalty for males for working part-time is larger than the penalty for women. And all these things and the gender pay gaps are going to actually affect time allocation in the household. And then we have individual specific ability. So we're changing notation, but this is just female and this is male. So this is kind of standard fixed effects in labor market. So and let me talk about how
exogenous or
the skill here.
That Ada?
Here, that's the slide.
Okay.
So here's the formation of the human capital, how it works. First, we kind of have education production function. It's more of a transition function, right? So it takes you from the parent's skill, so the parent's characteristics, and we have to kind of identify separately, like the education of the parents, their labor market skill. And these are all the investments of time of the parents and the monetary investment. Now, we don't have actual monetary investment, so this is income of the parents in the first 5 years. Now, this is number of siblings under the age of, actually only number of siblings under the age of 5. We put it there to see if it, for several reasons. But this is a stochastic function. So once I know that, there's going to be, when you reach the age of 18, you have a shock, the omega, and then your education is determined. Okay, so that's how education is formed. Once the education level is determined, then the ability is determined. And the ability so prime is for kids, and is going to be the education production function plus another random shock, which is IID, and right now we're assuming that it's uncorrelated with the shock that created the education. And that's the process. Now,
but what is omega? Is E a continuous thing, or that's the
so education is going to be just for mutually exclusive, like less outcomes less than high school, some college, and college.
Omega is just going to move you around in that distribution, conditional on all of this other stuff.
Right. So, but we still have to, identify, because all these things are obviously endogenous, like income, time with kids, and parents' characteristics. So we have to separate, and we're estimating it separately. The third assumption, we're not really imposing it in estimation, that the shocks, to ability and education are uncorrelated. We just did it in the simulation. Go ahead.
So the shocks stationary. I mean, like
IID.
And also like the mapping, like the gamma, that is also like across different generations, the mapping is the same.
Right, so we're going to have a stationary equilibrium. That means first the matching function is stable. It's basically the same across the conditional probability of you given your education matching with this, with a partner with certain education has to be the same. And yeah, so the forms are going to be.
Generate a pattern like the later generation kids maybe can have like more education compared with the parents.
So you need some stationarity. You really need the conditional probabilities to transition. So so you could have higher education, but it's still imposing that the conditional probability, the growth has to be disciplined, that the conditional probabilities, some ergodic condition, are actually the same as the generation before, and we're actually imposing it in estimation. We're estimating the matching function in practice with both generations, imposing that it's the same. Go ahead.
So these are the time for the first 5 years?
Yep.
Is it some of mother's time and father's time?
Separately, though. I'll show you.
Separately.
Yeah, so because actually the role of mother time and father's time, I'll show you, both are important and they're different.
Okay. So can we think of this evolution of we think of that, so it seems like you could think about, if you didn't change anything in the environment, or given whatever you estimate, you could think of that as coming out of some decision problem to choose education, conditional on all these things are the relevant state variables, and then there's something stochastic that also moves you around. I guess the problem is that if you do some sort of policy simulation, if you were sort of to change the returns to schooling or something, then that function wouldn't necessarily be stable. Okay.
Correct. So So we're given the assumption, it limits the type of counterfactuals we're doing. So
why can't you you could estimate that, and then can't you back out given the whole the value functions as of whatever date you think education choices are being made, and figure out kind of what would be the sort of, the typical way is you put the value functions and then you have some shock, and you're sort of choosing which of these value functions.
It is possible to include the education choice in the framework.
I think it could, like, even given your current estimates, you could sort of back that out, and then now you would.
That I'm not sure we can,
okay.
But it is possible to actually model it, depending on how you put the modeling in, and who knows what at what stage. You have to kind of be careful about that, but it is possible to incorporate choice. What I can back out.
If you're not doing policy simulations, or if you're not doing policy changes, then maybe that's not
right. So if I were to actually do policy simulation of the sort that you're trying to suggest, I would actually incorporate, and our framework could actually incorporate education choice. So right now I'm trying to kind of simplify things as much as I can.
Can you say one thing? Is there anything in the gamma function that drives positive associative matching in marriage? Are there complementarities between the characteristics of their parents?
So in this version, it's linear it's linear probability. We don't have interactions right here. So
what?
It doesn't.
Broad picture. What is driving positive associative matching in marriage in your model?
So it's not a choice here.
Okay.
But if you want to know what are the
Where are the positive complementarities if you want to understand the data?
it's coming from the interactions and the time and the behavior of the parents actually. So even without it's not the functional form. So even without, so what we show, so we could put some interactions, but even without putting interactions, I'll show you, you could generate complementarity through the decision makings and the decisions and the time allocation of the households.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to understand. Where,
yeah.
You know, as when you reduce down and you're thinking about what is the value of a particular education level husband getting together with a particular education level woman, you're going to find positive complementarity, and I'm trying to understand where it is in your model that you're getting those complementarities. Why is it?
So it could be that you could generate a higher surplus because the potential earnings are higher for both spouses. So when you have specialization patterns such that when you have a kid, what you could see in it's not here, but we see it from, for example, black-white couples, that higher earnings couples tend to have, even though the women have high earnings ability, husbands kind of increase labor supply and make a lot of money and allow the women to kind of cut back on labor supply and invest a lot in their kids and have a higher quality.
So forced towards negative.
Yeah, that's what I was
saying, right? So
not necessarily. It's
that's the traditional argument for why you want, the secondary earner to be less educated because.
Yeah. I see. Yeah. So. But couple of things here. No. Here
that I'm seeing are pushing in the direction of negative assortative matching. So I'm trying to understand where the positive is coming.
So let me couple of things. First, we don't have it's not exogenous. We could. I think that we've looked at the surpluses. We looked at the value. We can estimate value functions for different matches. I have to look back. So we do have several channels. I need to think about it more, but we could actually figure out what's going on. But it doesn't mean that this model generates positive assortative mating. That's a good point. We need to kind of. I'm not sure though that you'll see the interaction is kind of rich with the.
So you're going to have sort of the matches are going to be exogenous and it's going to be positive assortative mating, and the question is whether the model itself would generate that tendency given the forces that you have in it, or whether it's given the way you wrote it, it has to be something outside the model that's generating.
Yeah, because we have a more elaborate model with with kind of more like games between the spouses that kind of does have super modular properties, and marriage and divorce are not fully endogenous, and there I think you do get some complementarities. So, but I actually have to check. We could literally check empirically, like we have the value function, and we could literally check whether you have increasing differences. I haven't thought about it. We should do it, but we're not attempting here to explain it.
So the way that they get together is just exogenously
match
in the mating period. You're just going to say that there's a positive covariance.
Yeah, but all the behavior, given that education across generation is kind of endogenous, has to give you like consistent matching functions with the education, with the endogenous education across generations. So I need to actually check that's a good point, what causes complement, if it's actually caused here.
It plays a little bit of a role when you're deciding on how much education to give to your kid. You would, if you have positive assortative matching, you would imagine that part of the returns to education is that that there is a positive complementarity with their future spouse. But right now, if that's actually not present in your model, the fact that you're forcing Pam onto the marriages might actually...
Well, more educated wives will give you directly more educated kids, but I'm not... Let me think a little bit, because we do have a lot of interactions here that are coming from the dynamics of the decision, both of the fertility, and we're estimating basically how the utility from quality versus quantity. Mm-hmm. And so let me think about it. I know for sure value functions do increase in both educations of the spouses. I have to check whether there are increasing differences. But that's a good point. We kind of have to worry about it. So budget constraints. So we don't observe. So we have consumption for the household. It's unitary model, and we don't observe spending on kids. So the way we model it is that this is the number of current kids that you have. This is your income, and you spend a fraction of your income. Different households are going to spend different fractions of their income on their kids. Okay, so right now we're going to have the fraction of the income spent on kids depending on the education of both spouses, and then you have utility from consumption. Again, there is no borrowing and no saving, so you literally plug that budget constraint into the utility function. We have linear utility function. We don't have risk aversion here, and again, no borrowing, no savings. So we have the pecuniary utility. This is from income. And then you have non-pecuniary utility. And this is just a parameter for each combination of choices that you're making. You will have a parameter. Okay. So we're capturing the fact that if you put high time with kids, that this utility from working might be different. Full time might be different if you have birth or you don't have birth. So each combination of the choices would give you different non-pecuniary utility. And then you have preference shock, just like in standard discrete choice models, that is attached to each combination of choices, and it's IID and random. And then we will have, I'll show you the intergenerational ones. So this is, we literally take the discount factors in the Barrow-Becker model. We will have beta, this is this time discount factor between periods. And then we have, if you have one kid, then lambda would be how much you like how much you care about the utility of the kid versus the parent. We estimate it to be close to 0.8 in case I don't get to it. And there is going to be a curvature that the marginal utility from additional kid is kind of going
Can I
down.
just make sure? So B is either 0 or 1 if you have a child.
Yes.
And that's alpha n in the budget? I mean, there's an alpha n there and alpha there. Is that the same thing?
Alpha n.
On the
The
budget.
first, second bullet.
That alpha is
Sorry,
the same as
yeah.
And is
You're
that
right.
a choice? I just want to make sure. Is that a
No,
choice?
because we don't observe anything that allows us. So, but what it does, you're right. So if we had anything that has to do with expenditure of kids, we could have identified, but we don't have it. So what we are
The only
capturing,
choice in the budget constraint is B.
correct. And W is a function of labor supply of the households,
Okay.
of both households. Right. So you have that. And in addition, but what it means is that what we're really capturing in the utility function is differences from net utility from kids per period, right? So you have the utility from the kids from the utility function when they grow, but we have now number of kids in your utility function each period, and it can vary by your income and the education of the spouses. So really, given that we don't see, it's not really cost, it's just net benefit variation in utilities. All right. So here are the only sources of uncertainty. The matching function, and you're right, Rasmus, that we kind of need to explore whether it's consistent with with the complementarities here. But and we have preference shocks, which are IID across everything, each period. And then you have the uncertainty of the education outcome when the kids, after you've got you put all the inputs and they get the education outcome, and another one for the labor market ability or skill. Timing, okay, so each period you make the choices, and as I said, the important thing is that the ability and education of the kids is revealed after the parents finish doing all investment in all kids and are not fertile. So here is the utility function. Let me write it in a way that would look a little bit like the Barrow-Becker. So this is the utility at the beginning of your adulthood, right, for generation I. This is a household, so it's a unitary framework. So it's a female and male. This is your life cycle utility. So this is the discounted utility from living up to period T, expected at the beginning of your adulthood given that you only know the education and skill of the households. This is now at the time that you end, your end of your life cycle, so you're discounting it back. You get utility from the utility of your kids. Lambda is the discount factor, and this is expectations. And this is going to be expectations of number of kids. And this is an average utility of a kid. So this is the number of kids that you have, and then average over their household. So here it's the average, the household utility of the kid is in the household utility of the parent. And this is the transition function. That's where it comes in the expectations. And these are the utility of the households of your kids. Okay, so this is the dynastic structure. And this is the life cycle part. This is standard life cycle. You take expectations when you become adult at TE plus 1, and you just discount all your utility. I0 is the choices that you're going to make. And you could write the utility function at the optimal choice just as a function of the state variables. But this is the utility from consumption, basically, on all period, and the utility and the utility, the non-pecuniary benefits, and the shocks. So it's like a standard discrete choice finite model that is nested in the.
So people have their kids at different times. Is there a sort of an upper bar when, like, you can only have kids for so many years? Is that
46?
46.
Yeah. So we solve for stationary equilibrium, and a couple of things here. So we have wealth effect is going to imply positive correlation between fertility and education, roughly, if educated people earn more. But the opportunity cost of time is higher for more educated people. And the specialization, women who are married to more educated men can temporarily reduce. And you've seen labor supply, you've seen in the data that on average, college women actually work a little bit less than other women in annual hours and spend more time with their kids.
So the time cost is higher for more educated people. Do they, in your production function for the children, do more educated parents, is their time more valuable with the kids or not? Is that all separable?
So everything is separable, and you're right that we could, so we're estimating it outside, we could very easily add all these interactions, but so everything that is generated here is not coming from these functional forms, because these are linear, but it's coming from the dynamics and the decisions and the interactions. And we can generate, you'll see, a lot of persistence without those, actually. No.
When you say you're solving the stationary equilibrium, is this that you've estimated all the pieces of the model under the assumption of stationarity? You don't have to do this repeatedly when you estimate all those pieces, right? Or you do? Let
me show you how I estimate it. The answer is no, but let me. So assortative mating, it is exogenous here, and the degree of specialization would depend first on the gender pay gaps, and we need to figure out what is the effect of mothers versus father in the production function that would have influence as well. So estimations, how much time do I have?
You have till 10:05 or so.
Okay.
You have 20 minutes.
Okay, so we have another paper on methodology of how to estimate this type of models, and you could have a lot of extensions, actually. But it's computationally, if I can give a plug, it's enormous. You could estimate very large models in fairly short time. So here are the steps. First, we estimate the earnings equations and the fixed effect. The only unobserved heterogeneity that is persistent that we have here is the fixed effect, is the skill. But you could estimate it we estimated in a first step, so in principle now it's observed to the econometrician. Then you have to estimate all the conditional choice probabilities, and you need the fixed effect to put, they have to be a function of this unobserved type, so that's kind of important.
I guess because there's no education choice, it's not, you don't have to worry about the selection on the education stuff. Okay.
Yeah. If you do, your CCPs would look different once you have education choice. And then education, household type. The CCPs are a function of all the systematic state variables, and then you could estimate the children.
You need to say what that is for our macro colleagues. Right? I mean, you know what CCP is?
Oh, conditional choice probabilities. Yeah. And then yeah. And then we have the children education production function parameters. Now, we estimate it outside the models, and we basically use, so here it's linear probability models. You could do fancier control function stuff. Basically, you're using exclusion restrictions or instruments within the system, and I'll show you what we're doing. You could do it in various ways. People have estimated production functions in a way. And also, but notice in this stage, we already know the unobserved heterogeneity, so it's controlled for in the estimation of the production function. So we estimate all those and the transition functions, meaning this, the G, the matching functions outside the model. And our inputs, let's skip first two. So if it was a standard problem, once you estimate the first step, you use standard techniques basically for estimating discrete choice models. So we are using specifically Hotz, Miller, Sanders, and Smith, so it's a partial solution. But basically what you're getting, you're going to get moment conditions for the choices. And in this step, you're estimating the utility function parameters. The main problem is that you have to have a representation that takes you from the value function or the differences in the value function to the per period utility parameters. And in the dynastic problem, you're stuck at the end of your life cycle with another value function. So you, what we've done is derive a representation for the generational problem to transform it into something that looks like the standard techniques. So basically, in the third step, you're really estimating moment conditions, and this is where you're estimating the utility function. Now back to the stationarity question. First, we're imposing here that these functions are the same. We're estimating it out of everybody, the earnings equation, everything. And then you form the moment condition, so you don't do things repeatedly.
What are the intergenerational transition functions? What are all those?
The intergenerational. Oh, so now it's just the education. We have papers that you have. Yeah.
Here's
so,
just the education transition.
And yes, here is just the education and skill transition function.
So is it for step 2 that you really need stationarity?
Yes, for the representation. Now we're kind of working to reduce it in several ways because we obviously lose. It's possible, but nobody has estimated before dynastic models, and so we're doing it in steps. So right now it's important for the representation. Actually, we're using it.
How long is the panel?
So we have. You don't need. So we're not using the. We don't need like. So we need to see the parents working. The parents are a long sample, but the kids, we don't have such a long sample, and because of the stationarity, we don't need the kids because we're assuming everything is the same. We don't need to see all the kids for a long time. All we need is really their educational outcomes. But for some kids, we have, we do have, 4 years in the labor market for some, but you don't have to have all that because of the stationarity. So the panel is kind of long, but it's longer for the first generation. So given that we're not using the same sample to estimate all the steps, it's a little bit, you can restrict your sample less.
I suppose what you're saying is if you're in steady state and you don't need the panel to be very long, switched around, if you have a very long panel, you might be pushing the stationarity assumption. If you actually went and looked at your aggregate states, they might not look particularly stable in your panel. So, for example, the question about increasing education across generations.
There are a lot of things. We know that there have been changes, like the gender wage gap has changed. So you're right. So we are missing several changes. The only thing is that we don't have two distinct generations, so there is a bit of overlap between the generation, and so actually the average education is not that different. So that kind of mitigates it, but not fully. So I agree that it needs to be, it's useful to extend it to, and I think it's possible. So in the interest of time, earnings equation is fairly standard. So I want to just show you graphs of the main results that would matter for the simulations. So these are the part of the age education profile we're estimating by education from. So these are log earnings. So you could kind of see what you expected for college grads. It's the purple line. You have a much faster growth over the life cycle, and it goes the way you would think. Then you have some college. Then you have college, and then you have high school dropouts and high school. This is kind of interesting because it's important for the specialization patterns, and as Rasmus said, we know that has changed. But here you have males and females, and this is how much are you losing each year from having experience in part-time jobs versus full-time jobs? What is the gap? So this is the women are the dotted orange line, and the males are the blue. And you could see that for males, it's more costly to choose part-time relative to full-time. So
how is this estimated? Just with OLS, or
it's just fixed effect? Yeah, it's fixed effect. Yeah.
So there's no worrying about selection.
Well, the fixed effect are the only.
Okay. Yeah.
It's the only unobserved heterogeneity in our model. So it's consistent. What we're doing is consistent with the modeling, but. And then you have gender gaps by level of education. So all these kind of enter the decisions. More important, so I don't want to spend too much time. It's in other papers. So you could estimate the production function. We do just 3-stage least square, literally linear. And you don't get much from doing more complicated things. But let me tell you what we are actually doing. So basically, we're using 3-stage least square. So we have instruments. We have exclusion restrictions within the system, right? You have equations for fertility because you have number of young siblings, for income, for time with kids. And here's what we're using as instruments. We're assuming, or as exclusion restriction, that we use the age earning profile variation. So we take the age of the mother and the father, let's say at age when the kid is 6, and what we are assuming is that it affects directly the earnings, right? Your earnings, but it doesn't affect directly the time you spend with kids, only through the decisions of the labor market distribution. So it's an exclusion restriction. It only affects the time spent with kids through your decisions of labor supply.
What does?
Age the parents when the kid is 5, and square of the father and the mother, and squares of that. It's been used a lot in the literature. The second one we're using is like an Angris and Evans instrument. So given your number of kids, you have certain percentage of boys, for example. So that affects, it affects your fertility decision, and it affects also, it doesn't affect directly your labor supply, but it affects the time you spend with kids. So it can only affect your labor time through the effects of fertility and other, and time with kids. Because actually, I'll show you next, given any inputs, girls are always doing better than boys. So time with kids is...
Sorry. I mean, the best explanation we have for why you spend more different amounts of time with boys and girls is that the technology, skill formation is different for them, right? There are different demands on time. Isn't the exclusion restriction that there's no difference in this transmission function?
No, there is difference. We're assuming that this is, we're actually using that variation, that because you have, the technology, actually it is using it, is different for boys and girls. Given the input of time, then your sex composition would affect your input on time with kids, but not directly your labor supply, only through how much time you spend with the kids or fertility decisions.
Okay.
So,
all right. Okay.
Yeah.
I think I understand.
Oh, yeah. So just the main things on the production function. First, so you could see first, this is linear system. These are 4 mutually exclusive categories. The omitted one is less than high school. So it's very easy to see what's going on. College, some college, high school. So father and mother's time matter in a different way. So mother's time basically increases probability of going to college, and father's time, it's not statistically significant, but father's time truncates the bad outcome. It increases the probability that you at least finish high school. I'm not going to say more because it's actually quantitatively, the effects are really large of the time. And let me go to the results. Actually, the model fits okay. Let me go to the counterfactuals. I want to do the following. I want to take the correlation. So we simulate them. We estimate the model. We're not matching any correlations or mobility parameters, right? It's not a fundamental parameter of the model. We simulate the model, and then we kind of just, you can run regressions of fathers and whatever you want. And we do that. So run regressions of father-son incomes. And this is the data. Our model actually generates less correlation, let's say average earnings between 30 and 40 than the data. Actually, we match the mobility across percentiles of better than the correlation. Okay, so now we want to say why. Here's the first counterfactual. Let's eliminate anything that kind of pretty much generate persistence. The matching function is uniform, right? So there is no assortative mating. Earnings equation doesn't compensate, the compensation for full-time is twice as much part-time, because I forgot to say it's going to be important that there is disproportionately reward to full-time versus part-time. And there is, in the utility function, we had the cost of kids, or the net utility basically for kids. We eliminate the education variation from there. So no variation by education in the utility function. No variation, the production function. There is no variation in education in the production function, okay? So all these things generate persistence.
So all that's left is what, the ability transmission?
Yeah, exactly. So but the ability itself, and we add here, yeah, one by one. First we add assortative mating, then we add the age earning profiles, education, age earning profiles to the wage equation. Then we add the returns to experience, and then the part-time versus full-time. Then we add the education cost of kids in the utility function, the education variation. Lastly, we're going to add like the, after the full-time, part-time, we're going to add the correlation, the impact of education, the direct impact of education of parents on kids, which is actually important. Here's what I want to say quickly. So only having like variation in fixed effect did nothing. Pretty much to correlation. Would be the correlation that the model predicts. If you just add the assortative mating, this is kind of surprises. It doesn't add almost anything. Add the age earning profile a little bit, not much. Oh, because we have different measures of correlation. One is like average earnings on average earnings, mothers and daughters, fathers and son. But it's the same idea. Look at counterfactual 3. That generates the first one that kind of moves the correlation, and actually close to 70% of the correlation is back once you add returns to experience in the labor market. So that's the labor market. That's what I meant when I said the earning function structure matters a lot to correlation. You add full-time, part-time, you shoot up a lot above the observed correlation. What brings it back, in fact, is adding back to the basically net utility of kids by education in the utility function. So these are the main results that I want to add. The last one, yes, the correlation in the production function or nature, this is cumulative, does add correlation, but if you do it one by one, so this is cumulative, we've done it just separately, each one, still the returns to experience generates the largest persistence in earnings across generation. The second largest one is like what we call nature, the education or skill transmission.
So what's the economics or intuition behind that?
Here, that's the main results of the paper. So this is surprise, that was kind of surprising for us. And here is what's going on. Because you kind of have dynamics in the labor market decision, so the cost of withdrawing or working part-time in the labor market, right, has dynamic implications. It turns out that once you add this dynamics into because the age earning profiles, the deterministic part didn't do it. So the female labor supply and full-time work increases the most for household once you add the experience in which both spouses are educated. In fact, the college educated has the highest response in increase of full-time labor supply of females. Now, the total time with kids of these females declined. Again, it's relative to the bottom, like household with low education. But the time per child spent for college-educated or very educated couples have increased. So what happens because of this dynamics and returns to experience? What happens is that the decline in fertility, there is quantity-quality trade-offs. The very educated females find it very costly not to work full-time, so they have less kids, and then there is demand for quality that is increasing with wealth as well. And then they're kind of putting more time with kids, so their outcomes of their kids is increasing a lot. And this is disproportionately true in the more educated households relative to the bottom. And of course, if you add the part-time versus full-time, it kind of shoots up. That's result number one, that structure of the market kind of generate a lot of persistence.
So you're basically saying that these experience, the impacts affect fertility choices a lot, and that so more educated families with these returns to experience, more educated families or more able women and families just want to have fewer children and then just invest a lot in them, and that's what drives this product. Is that
exactly? So you have less kids, and then at the same time the demand, you also have more income, and then because you work more, and then the demand for quality is kicking in, and that happens. It's much more pronounced at the top end of the education relative to the bottom end. That's the main result. Maybe number one that was surprising. Number two is that the Barrow-Becker argument. So in Barrow-Becker, the basic model, there is no persistence in wealth because more wealthier people simply have more kids and the bequest per child is the same. This kind of flavor of stuff is still here because when we add what we're capturing in the utility function is really that the demand for kids is increasing with income. That's what, and once you add variation in education of the households into the utility function, you see that the correlation declines because fertility is actually of college-educated females is increasing a lot. Overall, the time with kids goes up, but the quality per child goes down. And so both forces are here, even though in the cross-section here, we didn't see the more educated people. They had a little bit more kids. So that actually drives down the correlation. But the other force, as we could see from the labor market experience, matter a lot. So for future work, we think taxation and things that happen in the labor market might actually have a lot of effect on persistence and mobility across generations.
I mean, when you first showed us those summary statistics, shouldn't you break down the summary statistics a little bit on give us more information about that one line? Because it seems like...
I agree. Yes. We should kind of go back to the main results and present it in a... That's a good idea. It was just summaries. Because it turns out it was more central than what I thought it would be. I thought fertility wouldn't play a huge role here. And it's not... And the fact assortative mating matters, but not by itself. It amplifies the correlation if you add it on top of the labor market. So the order matters. We've done that. So, but it only matters, which makes sense. It matters because women labor supply kind of, the elasticity is fairly high of labor supply. So it makes sense that the only reason assortative mating matters is because you have action in the female labor supply margin and fertility. So. Yes. So, all right. So I just want to say that markets here matter. The structure of earnings generates a lot of persistence. Parental time with kids, both mother and father, have actually really large impact despite our noisy measure, like quantitatively. And it's important to also think about fertility decisions. And the margin, and that's roughly what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Last question or
so? This is a paper about correlation, so I take this as a matter of curiosity. But it seems like the mechanism you're describing, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like one in which what's going on is you're creating an upper quartile, let's say, in which the transmission is very persistent. So I have fewer kids, and they're going more likely also to be in this upper quartile or whatever, but I'm also sort of thinning out that tail, that upper tail. So in terms of these mechanisms distributionally,
I didn't have time. I exactly put a slide of that because we looked at all the distributions of the transitions by percentiles.
Yeah.
It's exactly.
Okay.
No,
there's a lot of like rich stuff going on there.
Yeah, so it's exactly right. What you're saying is like you're increasing like with the persistence at the top. The probability if your parents in the top 20, their kids will remain in the top 20 percentile is increasing, and the probability that the bottom 20 percentile kids remain in the in the bottom 20 is increasing, and
okay.
Yeah. So we've actually explored all the transitions.
Okay. Thank you. Well,